scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a quiet evening when Peppa and George were playing in their bedroom. The toys scattered across the floor seemed perfectly normal, but something felt different tonight. The teddy bear that usually sat on the shelf was now facing the wall, and the toy dinosaur's eyes seemed to follow their every movement. Peppa noticed it first when she picked up her favorite doll. The doll's smile was wider than usual, stretching unnaturally across its plastic face. When she blinked, the smile seemed to grow even larger, revealing tiny sharp teeth. George giggled nervously, pointing at his toy car which had somehow moved to the center of the room. Downstairs, Mummy Pig was preparing dinner when she heard strange scratching sounds from inside the walls. The kitchen lights flickered once, twice, then stayed dim. The family portrait on the wall began to change slowly. Their smiles were becoming twisted, their eyes turning completely black. Daddy Pig was reading his newspaper when the words started rearranging themselves. Instead of weather news, the headlines now read messages about shadows that walk and toys that dream. The television turned on by itself, showing static that occasionally formed a pig's face with hollow, empty eyes. The children came downstairs for dinner, but the table was set for 6 people instead of 4. 2 extra plates sat there with food that looked exactly like theirs, but the portions were moving slightly, as if something invisible was taking bites. As night fell, the house began to change. The wallpaper started peeling, revealing underneath what looked like another house entirely. A house where everything was the same but wrong. The family photos showed the same poses, but the faces were all blank, featureless ovals. Peppa tried to go to sleep, but her reflection in the bedroom mirror wasn't copying her movements. When she waved, her reflection stood still. When she stood still, her reflection waved back with that unnaturally wide smile. George's reflection was pointing at something behind him, something that wasn't there. The house itself seemed to be breathing. The walls expanded and contracted slowly, like the inside of some enormous creature. The floorboards creaked in rhythm, keeping time to a heartbeat that was far too slow to be human. Every door was slightly ajar, revealing glimpses of rooms that shouldn't exist. In the middle of the night, all 4 family members found themselves standing in the living room, though none remembered getting up. They stood in a perfect circle, facing outward, their eyes closed but somehow still seeing everything around them. The morning came, but the sun looked different, too bright, too white, casting shadows in wrong directions. When they looked out the windows, their neighborhood was still there, but all the other houses were empty. No people, no movement, just empty windows staring back like hollow eyes. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary morning when Peppa woke up in her bedroom, but something felt different. The sunlight streaming through her window seemed dimmer than usual, casting strange shadows across her pink walls. As she got dressed in her red dress, she noticed her reflection in the mirror was smiling even when she wasn't. Downstairs, Mummy Pig was making breakfast, but her usual cheerful humming had been replaced by an eerie silence. When Peppa entered the kitchen, Mummy Pig turned around with a smile that stretched too wide across her face, revealing teeth that seemed sharper than before. "Good morning, Peppa," she said in a voice that sounded hollow and distant. George was already at the breakfast table, but he wasn't playing with his dinosaur toy. Instead, he sat perfectly still, staring at his cereal bowl with unblinking eyes. When Peppa tried to talk to him, he slowly turned his head toward her, and she saw that his eyes had become completely black, like empty holes in his face. After breakfast, Peppa decided to visit her best friend Susie Sheep. As she walked through the neighborhood, she noticed that all the houses looked exactly the same as always, but there were no other animals outside. The streets were completely empty, and the only sound was the echo of her own footsteps on the pavement. When she reached Susie's house, the door was already open. Peppa called out, but there was no answer. She stepped inside and found Susie in the living room, sitting on the purple sofa. But Susie wasn't moving, and when Peppa got closer, she realized that Susie's wool had turned gray and her eyes were staring straight ahead without blinking. Frightened, Peppa ran back home, but when she arrived, she found that her house had changed. The yellow walls had become a sickly green color, and the windows were now completely black. Inside, she could hear voices calling her name, but they didn't sound like her family anymore. Peppa tried to run to her room, but the hallway stretched endlessly before her. The family photos on the walls showed the same smiling faces, but their eyes followed her as she moved. She could hear footsteps behind her, getting closer and closer, but when she turned around, there was nothing there. Finally reaching her bedroom, Peppa slammed the door shut and hid under her covers. But even there, she could hear whispers coming from the walls themselves. The whispers grew louder until they became a chorus of voices all saying the same thing. "You can never leave, Peppa. This is your home now." When she peeked out from under her blanket, she saw that her bedroom window no longer showed the outside world. Instead, it displayed the same room she was in, creating an infinite reflection of herself hiding in bed. And in each reflection, she could see that her own smile was becoming wider and more sinister, just like everyone else's. As the whispers continued, Peppa realized that she was becoming part of whatever had taken over her world. Her reflection in the endless windows began to move independently, waving at her with movements she wasn't making. The last thing she remembered was her own voice joining the chorus of whispers, welcoming the next visitor to their perfect, scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning when Peppa woke up in her bedroom, but something felt different. The sunlight streaming through her window seemed dimmer than usual, casting strange shadows across her pink walls. As she got dressed in her favorite red dress, she noticed her reflection in the mirror was moving just a fraction of a second too late. Downstairs in the kitchen, Mummy Pig was making breakfast as always, but her smile seemed frozen in place, never changing even when she spoke. Daddy Pig sat reading his newspaper, but his eyes never moved across the pages, and the same headline appeared over and over again. George was playing with his dinosaur toy, but the toy's roar sounded more like a scream. When Peppa arrived at playgroup, all her friends were there waiting for her. Susie Sheep, Rebecca Rabbit, Pedro Pony, and all the others stood in a perfect circle in the middle of the classroom. Their eyes were completely black, like deep holes in their faces, and their smiles stretched far too wide, revealing rows of sharp, pointed teeth. Madame Gazelle stood at the front of the classroom, but she wasn't moving at all. She was completely still, like a statue, with that same terrifying smile frozen on her face. The clock on the wall had stopped at exactly 9:15, and no matter how long Peppa stared at it, the hands never moved. The children began to sing their usual songs, but the words were all wrong. Instead of happy nursery rhymes, they sang about dark places where lost children go, about shadows that follow you home, and about games that never end. Their voices echoed strangely in the classroom, as if coming from somewhere far away. Peppa tried to run, but her legs felt heavy and slow, like she was moving through thick mud. The door to the classroom seemed to get further away the more she ran toward it. Behind her, she could hear the other children laughing, but it wasn't the happy laughter she remembered. It was cold and hollow, like the sound of wind through empty houses. When she finally reached the door, it wouldn't open. The handle turned, but the door stayed firmly shut. Through the window, she could see the playground outside, but it was completely empty and covered in a thick, gray fog. The swings moved back and forth by themselves, creaking loudly in the silence. Peppa turned back to face the classroom, and all the children were standing right behind her now, much closer than before. Their black eyes stared at her without blinking, and their sharp-toothed smiles grew even wider. They reached out their hands toward her, and she noticed their fingers were much longer than they should be, with pointed nails like claws. The walls of the classroom began to change color, shifting from bright yellow to a sickly green, then to deep purple, and finally to complete black. The windows disappeared entirely, leaving them all trapped in a dark room with no way out. The only light came from the children's glowing eyes, which cast eerie shadows that danced on the walls. As the darkness closed in around them, Peppa realized that this wasn't her real playgroup at all. This was somewhere else entirely, a place that looked like her world but felt completely wrong. The children weren't her friends anymore. They were something else, something that had been waiting for her to arrive. The last thing Peppa heard before everything went completely black was the sound of all the children speaking in unison, their voices blending together into one terrifying whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once, saying words she couldn't understand but somehow knew meant that she would never be going home again. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning when Peppa woke up, but something felt different. The sunlight seemed dimmer, casting strange shadows across her pink walls. As she got dressed, her reflection in the mirror was moving just a fraction too late. Downstairs, Mummy Pig was making breakfast in eerie silence. When Peppa looked closely, she saw that Mummy Pig's eyes had turned completely black, like dark holes in her face. Yet she continued cooking as if nothing had changed. George came running into the kitchen, but his pink skin seemed to shimmer and shift. When he opened his mouth to say dinosaur, the word came out as a low, haunting whisper that echoed through the house. Daddy Pig appeared at the breakfast table, but his glasses reflected images that weren't in the room. In the lenses, Peppa could see twisted versions of their house. When Daddy Pig smiled, his teeth had become sharp and pointed. The family sat down to eat, but the food on their plates kept changing. One moment it was bacon and eggs, the next it was something dark and writhing. Peppa tried to speak, but her voice sounded far away. Outside, the familiar green hills had turned gray and barren. The trees had no leaves, and their branches reached toward the house like grasping fingers. Other houses stood empty with dark windows that seemed to watch her. When they decided to visit Grandpa Pig's farm, the car ride felt endless. The road stretched on forever, and no matter how long they drove, they never got closer. The landscape kept repeating itself, like they were trapped in a loop. At the farm, Grandpa Pig was tending vegetables that had grown into impossible shapes. The carrots were twisted into spirals, and the potatoes had eyes that blinked when no one was looking. The chickens had stopped clucking and instead made sounds like whispered secrets. Their feathers had turned midnight blue, and they moved in perfect synchronization. When Peppa tried to feed them, they all turned to look at her with glowing eyes. As the day wore on, strange things continued. The sun stopped moving across the sky, freezing directly overhead. Shadows began to move independently, creeping across the ground like living things. When evening should have come, the sky remained the same pale, sickly color. The family gathered to watch television, but every channel showed an empty room that looked exactly like theirs, but with no one in it. Peppa tried to go to bed, but her bedroom had changed. The walls seemed to stretch higher than before, and her bed felt like it was floating in an endless void. When she closed her eyes, she could hear voices calling her name. In the morning, everything had returned to normal. But as she looked in the mirror while brushing her teeth, her reflection was smiling even though she wasn't. In the background, she could see shadowy figures. The family went about their day as usual, but Peppa couldn't shake the feeling that they were all just pretending. Every smile seemed forced, every laugh sounded hollow. She began to wonder if the strange day had ever really ended, or if this was just another part of the nightmare that would never end. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary evening in the Pig family house when something extraordinary began to happen. Peppa and George were playing in their bedroom when they noticed their toys behaving strangely. The teddy bears seemed to be watching them with unblinking button eyes, and the toy dinosaur that George loved so much appeared to move slightly when no one was looking directly at it. Mummy Pig was downstairs preparing dinner when she heard an unusual sound coming from the children's room. It wasn't the normal laughter and chatter she was used to hearing. Instead, there was an eerie silence punctuated by soft whispers that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. She called up to the children, but received no response. Daddy Pig was reading his newspaper when the television began changing channels by itself. Each channel showed the same thing, an empty playground with swings moving back and forth in the wind, even though there was no wind visible anywhere else. The playground looked exactly like the one where Peppa and her friends usually played, but something was fundamentally wrong with it. Upstairs, Peppa and George discovered that their bedroom door had somehow locked itself from the outside. They tried calling for their parents, but their voices seemed to be absorbed by the walls themselves. The room began to feel smaller, as if the walls were slowly moving inward. Their toys had arranged themselves in a perfect circle around the children, all facing them with expressions that had somehow changed from friendly to menacing. The family portraits hanging on the walls throughout the house began to shift and change. In each picture, the smiling faces of the pig family gradually transformed into expressions of concern, then worry, then outright fear. It was as if the photographs were trying to warn the real family about something terrible that was approaching. As night fell, the house itself seemed to come alive. Doors creaked open and closed on their own. Footsteps echoed through empty hallways, and whispers filled every room. The kitchen appliances turned themselves on and off in a rhythmic pattern that almost sounded like a heartbeat. Grandpa Pig arrived for his usual evening visit, but when he knocked on the front door, it swung open to reveal a house that looked exactly the same yet felt completely different. The familiar yellow walls seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. The children found themselves drawn to the window, where they could see their neighborhood transformed. All the houses looked identical to theirs, stretching endlessly in every direction. Other families could be seen through the windows, but they all moved in perfect synchronization, as if controlled by some unseen force. The final realization came when they looked in the mirrors throughout their house and saw not their own reflections, but the reflections of a different family entirely. A family that looked exactly like them, but with eyes that held no recognition, no warmth, no life. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning when Peppa woke up in her bedroom, but something felt different. The sunlight streaming through her window seemed dimmer than usual, casting strange shadows across her pink walls. As she got dressed in her favorite red dress, she noticed her reflection in the mirror was smiling even though she wasn't. Downstairs in the kitchen, Mummy Pig was making breakfast, but her movements were too mechanical, too precise. She flipped pancakes with the exact same motion over and over again, never blinking, never stopping. When Peppa said good morning, Mummy Pig turned around with that same perfect smile, but her eyes were completely black. George was already at the breakfast table, playing with his toy dinosaur as always. But today, the dinosaur seemed to be moving on its own, its tiny plastic head turning to watch Peppa as she sat down. George giggled, but the sound was wrong, too deep, too knowing for a little pig his age. Daddy Pig came down the stairs, his newspaper in hand, but when he opened it, all the pages were blank except for one headline that read, "They're watching you, Peppa," in dripping red letters. He didn't seem to notice anything unusual and began reading aloud from the empty pages about weather that would never come. After breakfast, Peppa decided to visit her best friend Susie Sheep. The walk to Susie's house felt longer than usual, and the familiar streets seemed to stretch endlessly. The houses she passed had windows that followed her movement, and the cheerful yellow sun in the sky had developed a sinister grin. When she arrived at Susie's house, everything looked normal from the outside. But when Susie answered the door, her wool was matted and dark, and her eyes had the same black emptiness as Mummy Pig's. Susie invited her in with a voice that sounded like it was coming from somewhere far away. Inside Susie's house, all the furniture was floating 3 feet off the ground, rotating slowly in perfect circles. Susie's family sat in their floating chairs, having tea in midair, acting as if nothing was wrong. They offered Peppa a cup of tea that steamed with purple vapor and smelled like old flowers. As Peppa tried to leave, she realized the door wouldn't open. The windows showed only darkness outside, even though it had been bright daylight moments before. Susie and her family continued their floating tea party, their heads turning in unison to stare at Peppa with those terrible black eyes. Suddenly, Peppa found herself back in her own house, but everything was wrong. The walls were breathing, expanding, and contracting like lungs. The family portraits on the walls showed twisted versions of themselves with too many eyes and smiles that stretched beyond their faces. In the living room, the television was on, but it only showed static. Within the static, Peppa could see shapes moving, reaching toward the screen as if trying to escape. The purple sofa had grown teeth along its edges, and the coffee table was covered in photographs of Peppa sleeping, taken from impossible angles. George appeared in the doorway, but he was wrong too. His body stretched upward like taffy, and when he spoke, His voice came from behind Peppa instead of from his mouth. He asked if she wanted to play a game, but the game was to count how many eyes were watching them from the walls. Mummy and Daddy Pig joined them in the living room, but they moved like marionettes, their limbs jerky and unnatural. They sat down for their usual evening routine, but instead of talking about their day, they spoke in unison about how much they loved having Peppa home forever and ever and ever. The house began to shake, and through the windows, Peppa could see that their yellow house was now floating in a void of absolute darkness. There were no other houses, no ground, no sky, just their home suspended in nothingness while her family continued their impossible routine. As night fell inside the floating house, Peppa realized that tomorrow would be exactly the same. She would wake up, see her wrong reflection, have breakfast with her black-eyed family, visit Susie's floating house, and return to walls that breathed and furniture that watched. And she would do it again and again, forever, in this place that looked like home but was something else entirely. The last thing Peppa saw before the darkness took her was her own reflection in the television screen. But this time, her reflection was smiling that same terrible smile, and its eyes had turned completely black.